In this lecture, I'd like to explore with you some thoughts about the anger of God. Here's the situation before us. As we read the first part of the Bible, the Old Testament, the divine actions that we see there, things that are performed by God, can lead to a self-portrait of God that, as we take it on in a whole, it seems to be dominated by displays of anger and violence. And yet, when we transition from the close of the Hebrew Bible into the New Testament, this same God seems to be characterized by a different set of traits that are marked by generosity and kindness. Well, that's quite a difference, isn't it? How can we reconcile such apparently conflicting portraits? And that's what I'd like to explore with you in this lecture. How significant is this question, and how long have people been pondering it? As early as Marcion, a Christian of the 2nd century, we have record of people having just a terrific problem with the portrayal of the violence of God and anger in the Hebrew Bible, and then encountering the compassion of God in the Greek Bible, that is, in the New Testament. And this led Marcion, for one, to determine that it would simply be best to reject as non-canonical the Old Testament, and along with it, to set aside, to regard as non-authoritative, non-inspired, those parts of the New Testament which seem to have close ties with Judaism. Often during this lecture, I'll be referring to a valuable volume by Abraham Joshua Heschel. The volume's called The Prophets. You may have it in a single volume, but as you look at it closely, it's comprised of two. Here's one of the quotes that I feel is helpful. It kind of sets the scene for our discussion. "Few passions," Heschel writes, "have been denounced so vehemently by teachers of morality as the passion of anger." Incidentally, in this part of the book, he's not thinking simply of Christian teachers of morality, but he's thinking more widely. And one of the benefits of Heschel is he reaches into classical Greek philosophy and writing. So when he says teachers of morality, he's just talking globally and over all time, not just related to Jewish thinking, although he was Jewish, or thinking of Christian orientation or persuasion. So, anger, denounced vehemently. It's pictured, he continues, as a sinister, malignant passion, an evil force, which must under all circumstances be suppressed. I wonder if you reflect personally on your concept of anger, if you resonate with this, if you say, yes, that's kind of how I've been brought up. And what I've seen of anger has been so damaging, so harmful, nothing beneficial about it, that the best thing is really to put a lid on it and try and diffuse it, try and mollify it somehow, try and take the sting out of it and just make it go away. Here's an overview of the direction I'd like to head it with you in the next few minutes. First, let's take a fairly candid look at evidence for divine anger in the Old Testament. And then we'll contrast that with some exceptions to divine anger still in the Old Testament. Then let's shift to the New Testament and take a look at some evidence for divine compassion that we find there, contrasted finally with exceptions to divine compassion still in the New Testament. We'll wrap it up with some conclusions. First then, what are some of the actual cases where we find what can be validly labeled, or perhaps not validly labeled, but associatively labeled, divine anger and violence in the Old Testament? There are 5 that I'd like to take up, some of which are accurately connected with divine anger and some are not. First, Noah's flood. Who can deny, but this is a massive, and by all descriptions, it seems to be the most massive display in terms of quantity of lives affected. Massive display of God bringing, humanly speaking, premature termination, death, to a large group of human beings. The flood. What can we say of this? What, more importantly, what does Scripture say of it? I am persuaded that it's very important that we read part of what the writer records. Read all of what the writer records, but don't overlook this in particular, Genesis 6:6, the last part of that, when God acknowledges, the writer records that God is saying that having to do that grieved him to his heart. If we're to read between the lines of verse 6, and incidentally the first part of verse 6 says that in essence God changed his mind about creating the human race, seeing where it wound up, seeing the precipice of harm and violence, of denigration, that it just jumped over, leaping into this abyss. We get the picture of God with basically his head in his hands, saying, "What have I done?" Now, you may be troubled by such candor and such anthropomorphic language, and certainly we're taking interpretive liberties in imagining that, and yet that's the direction towards which this language points our imagination. It grieved him to his heart. He was so distraught. We must anchor then in this first expression of catastrophe incited. Well, incited's the wrong word, isn't it? It was incited by the wickedness of us folks, but acted on by the initiative, the decisiveness of God. This catastrophic damage caused through the flood. What we want to register very, very deeply is that this was not a capricious God who willy-nilly is just saying, I don't feel good today. Or to take a portrayal, I'm reminded of how the Mesopotamian flood accounts, one of them, which has knowledge of this huge flood, and it explains it not so much as God's deep anguish over the harm caused to one another and disregard for himself through the wickedness of humankind. But they said, as I recall, the Mesopotamian account says, those guys are too rowdy. They're actually making too much noise, and it's bothering the group of deities there up on an upper level, and the folks down below who were created incidentally to serve, to be servants, to be in a lower status, serve the gods. They're making too much noise. I really don't like that, so we've got to quiet them down. Oh, this is not the picture that we get from the God of the Hebrew Bible, but one of great disappointment and great anguish. And we can accurately interpolate from this the last thing that God wanted to have to do was to bring this creative, shall we call it a creative experiment, to an end. Consequently, we want to register from Genesis 6:6 the just profound reluctance of God to be obliged to carry out this act of catastrophe. There's one more dimension that we want to keep in mind, and we'll come back to this later. But I've been impressed that there is a silent voice that we need to hear in this setting. If it is true, if the account is true, that every inclination of people's heart was to evil, then we should imagine, we should think about, we should consider who are the recipients of that evil? Is it simply that these people are behaving arrogantly towards God? God is the recipient of their callous arrogance. Or could it be that they're treating one another with arrogance, with indifference, and with violence? Think for a moment. Has there been precedent for that? Well, you've heard of Abel. Abel was the first victim. And God says that the blood of Abel cries out to him, crying out for justice. Well, if the unfolding of time leading up to the flood meant an exponential increase in evil, then would it not mean there would be an exponential increase in violence, human on human, and other forms of violence, who knows what, across creation? If there is behavior of a violent sort, that means that there are victims. And every day that God waits and waits and patiently waits, hoping against hope that somehow this human experiment will right itself, each day he waits, there are more victims. I ask you, how long can he afford to wait? What will it look like when he stops waiting? It will look like God is angry and violent. But we need to ask why. The next evidence of divine anger and violence could come from the plagues of Egypt. And here I'm just dipping in to look at the last of the sequence of 10 plagues. This was the plague where God said the firstborn son in every Egyptian household will lose his life on this particular night. And I will use that to basically to force Pharaoh to change his mind. Oh, he's changed his mind before to let the Israelites go, but then it back again very swiftly. Now this will be a mind change long enough to let them go out. Two thoughts to consider in this regard. This was not violent as it was, right? Deadly as it was. And we're told that there was not a household across the Egyptians where there was not the sound of mourning. So very, very extensive. This was not, however, the first plague. That's worth considering. This is the last in a series of escalating plagues, warning signs, miraculous symbols to get the attention of Pharaoh and his rulers and the people. And I wonder if we recall this feature concerning one of those plagues, not the 10th, but it tells me something about God's mindset and his heart in this process of visiting the superpower, Egypt, with these graded catastrophes, ending in the 10th. Back in the 7th plague, this was a plague of hail, and we're told that it came with lightning and wreaked great devastation. But notice, before the plague of hail began, and Moses told them exactly when it would begin, what time of day. Before it began came this warning, and you might assume that some Egyptians would be softened by this point. This is plague number 7, so they've had 6 experiences of supernatural, various levels of supernatural disaster. And you might think that they might connect on their own and say, Moses says there's going to be some catastrophic weather at noon. Maybe I should take some preventative action, some protective action. God doesn't leave it to them to connect the dots. He just says flat out, you know what you really ought to do, even if you're not Israelite? You ought to get your livestock under cover. I'd really be glad if they survived. Well, you tell me, is this the attitude of a deity who is behaving capriciously and just hoping to wreak havoc on people and, frankly, hopes that they get as much damage as possible out of this hail? No, he wouldn't be warning them ahead of time. Don't forget this. As we read events of supernatural catastrophe in the Hebrew Bible and then extrapolate from that what's the character of God, don't forget about plague number 7. Now back to plague number 10. Why so severe, some might ask? Well, one explanation would be it took that degree of severity to finally persuade Pharaoh that he really had better relax his deathly tight grip on these slaves that God called his own firstborn. He really must do that. It took that much to convince. Some of you, as you are thinking about this, are recalling, well, doesn't it say that God was the one responsible for hardening Pharaoh's heart? So in reality, is Pharaoh capable of capitulating, of turning around and saying, okay, God, go ahead and take your people out of Egypt. They're free to go after plague number 5 or 6 or 7 or 8. That is an important discussion. A volume I would commend to you if you'd like to explore that in particular would be Marvin Wilson's work, Marvin Wilson. And the work is called Our Father Abraham. As I recall, the subtitle of that is The Jewish Origins of the Christian Faith. Again, Marvin Wilson, Our Father Abraham. And look up the section on block logic. And he mines the whole notion of how we're inclined to think along Greek logic lines over against Semitic block logic lines. And he has some fascinating insights concerning how the Hebrew Bible is at home with paradox. Who hardened his heart? God did. Pharaoh did. Both did, based on what perspective you look at it from. Again, I'll leave it to you to look up Marvin Wilson's work on that. Let's turn now to what's commonly called the conquest of Canaan. After the Exodus, Moses has died, and Joshua takes the people into Canaan, the land that God has pledged to give to them from hundreds of years before under Abraham. And here's a situation where we find the biblical record saying God has authorized the invasion of this land, including the killing of resident populations, Canaanite folk of different stripe, so as to make room for the Israelites to move in. By the way, did you notice how I put that just a moment ago? In order to make room for the Israelites to move in? I'll admit, when I said that, I was running on autopilot. I'm picturing this large group of people, promised land, they've got to move in, people are already there, and so you need to make room for them. But that's not how the biblical account records it. In other words, I'm not aware of any mention at all in the Hebrew Bible. It says the land was so crowded that they frankly had no room to shoehorn in another person unless someone either moved away or died. That would have been the implication of the way I put it initially. They had to make room for them. Now the Bible does explain why the early edge of Israel moving in, the early edge of it was wiping out these other people, but it doesn't at all say because there wasn't enough room for them. It says instead that God had been watching these people, and the picture we get was a lot like the people inhabiting the earth just prior to Noah's flood. The conduct was so disgusting to God that he, how shall we say, it's like visiting on them a localized flood, right? But it's not a flood. It's going to be a military encounter where these civilizations, these communities, are brought to a stop, just like the flood did. And he is giving instruction to Joshua and the people he's leading to be his agents. All right, let's use the word, his executioners, right? His agents to bring the Canaanite civilizations to a close. Now, a careful study of Joshua and the material right after that, Joshua and Judges, gives us messages that do not entirely, they don't coordinate real well together. In other words, there are some statements that say total annihilation of those people, and then there's some statements right next door to them that say, but actually a few of them survived. So one of the pieces that we bring to this discussion of the conquest and God-authorized killing of people ahead of the Israelites, people already in the land, is that the record's a little bit mixed. And that's an interpretational issue, and had we more time, we could look at that. I think it's not at all irreconcilable. I think there are issues of blanket statements that say this is generally what happened over against particular, what shall we say, exceptions, or zooming in and saying, well, it didn't happen universally. I was just speaking generally, wiping out all those people, but they didn't all get wiped out. Well, now we're getting into particulars, more drilling down a little more deeply into the interpretation of Joshua than we have time for, or than is the objective of this lecture. Let's back it up just a bit. You recall my misstatement saying that there wasn't enough room in the land, so God was moving people out to make a room for new people to come in, which is not the biblical account. What it does say instead, and now we're getting to the subpoints on this slide, in Leviticus, God says there were some things going on there that needed to stop. Tell you what, you've been reading the listing here, right? Incest, homosexual conduct, infanticide, and bestiality, really, what should we say? Sexual behavior that God relegates to what is deeply repulsive. Let's just use his language for that. Now here's the verse that the few verses that are helpful in that regard. Leviticus 18. Actually, it's the verses ahead of these, still at Leviticus 18, but 1 through 23, that catalog why God is willing to take such extreme measures against the prior inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, parenthetically asking Joshua, commanding Joshua and his people to carry it out. Now, what's helpful about what you see before you right now, Leviticus 18, 24 to 30, what I feel is helpful here are a couple of things. One is how God categorizes the misbehavior of the prior inhabitants. Okay, how does he rate it? What does it mean to him? How serious is it? And secondly, his even-handedness. I don't know what else to call it. Let's take the even-handedness first. You can look this over. Let's go ahead and roll through it, and notice especially the words that are color-coded in blue. So do not defile yourselves in any of these ways. Which ways? Let's see, those are the ways of incest and homosexuality, child sacrifice, and bestiality. That pretty well covers what's in Leviticus 18, 1 to 23. Don't defile yourselves in any of these ways. So defile, notice that language. Don't render yourselves impure. For by all these practices, the nations I am casting out before you. Okay, Israel is the agent, but God says, I'm the one taking responsibility for this. I'm casting them out before you. They have defiled themselves. Thus, and notice this, the land became defiled. See, God owns the land. People, in essence, rent it from him. He is the landlord of the earth. We rent it. We use a piece of it. And he says, these people came into my apartment and they trashed it. And I punished it for its iniquity. And the land vomited out its inhabitants. It's as though the land is personified in this most graphic way, isn't it? It's like the land is retching. It's just saying, I can't have you within me. I cannot host you any longer. It's like Jonah being spit out of spit out of the great fish. Right? I just can't have you inside anymore. I've got to get rid of you. So that is how the activities that these people, the prayer inhabitants, were involved in, that's how God categorizes them. They were trashing the environment. They were polluting the land. Interesting, isn't it? The years that you and I live in currently, we've become increasingly aware that we are guests on this planet, and we need to take care of it in terms of ecology, in terms of reducing pollution, taking care of the surroundings where we are. But there's a level of care, there's a dimension of pollution that our naturalistically inclined culture is unaware of, or if aware, is willfully blind. And that is the level of moral pollution. Moral pollution. And that's the one that God fingers here and says, this is deadly stuff. And frankly, I've got to put a stop to it. Verse 26, you shall keep my statutes, you Israelites, and my ordinances, and commit none of these abominations. Either the citizen or the alien. If a foreigner resides among you, they've got to abide by this too. 27, for the inhabitants of the land who were before you committed all those abominations, and the land became defiled. Otherwise, the land will vomit you out for defiling it. And there's the even-handedness that I was referring to earlier. What God is going to bring in the way of judgment on the Canaanites will be equally binding. The standards, the expectations for behavior are equally binding on the Israelites. Notice, incidentally, that the standards, the behavior standards that God is expecting or is faulting the Canaanites for ignoring were not things like keeping the Sabbath holy, were not things like observing particular Jewish ceremony, much of which had just been birthed through the Exodus, like observing the Passover or things like this. But it's really fundamental ethical behavior in human community, like don't kill children. Yes, so 28, otherwise the land will vomit you out for defiling it, as it vomited out the nation that was before you. For whoever commits any of these abominations shall be cut off from their people. So keep my charge, speaking to Israel, not to commit any of these abominations that were done before you, and not to defile yourselves by them. I am the Lord your God. Keep in mind this issue of not defiling and the identity of God are very important, because God has said, as you'll recall in Exodus, along about 19 to 24, and then 25 and following, I'm holy, you want to be my people, you'll need to be holy. And that's how we can have this covenant where I take you as my people, you take me as your God, and I live among you. And the only way that you can safely have me among you is if you become a people who are not defiled, people who are holy. The next instance of violence in the Old Testament that I'd like to look at is a fairly narrow one. Do you recall that Jephthah was one of the judges that God raised up to bring military relief to the Israelites during that period between Joshua and Samuel, moving on to the first king, Saul and David and so forth? In that period of judges, Jephthah was one who brought some military relief. Now, he made a serious promise to God at one point, and he said, God, I'm going against these enemies, and now I'll make you a deal. If you give me victory, then whatever is the first living creature that comes out of the door of my house, I'm going to give as a sacrifice to you. It sounds very pious, and it sounds like in terms of that day, a deep statement of devotion. Seemed good, right? Except what happened was the first living creature that came out of his house was his daughter, I suppose, running to greet him and congratulate him or see how the battle went. glad to welcome him home, right? That he survived his last military encounter. And so, grief-stricken, Jephthah, he keeps his word. He keeps this pledge that he's made to God, follows through. And although the statement, Jephthah killed his daughter, we don't find that, all the language around it makes it sound as though that's exactly what he did. And I'm regarding the account as that. Some would suggest that maybe she was consigned to live out the rest of her days never marrying. It seems like the simpler and frankly much more tragic understanding of the passage is that indeed Jephthah had his daughter sacrificed. Now, some might catalog this and put it on God's tab, as it were, in the Old Testament, and say, here's one more case of God being violent and God somehow being pleased with this behavior. At least he doesn't stop it. Okay, that's right. We have no record of an angel showing up or a prophet showing up. That's true. And there's quite a bit, isn't there, in Judges, where the people just careen their way along, and I use that word very intentionally. There is a headlong plunge towards civil war and self-destruction that just is rampant through the book of book of Judges. We need to remember that context when we look at this story, because there's nothing to suggest that God extracted that particular pledge from Jephthah. He did that of his own will. Looked good on the surface. Nor is there any indication that God extracted the follow-through of that foolish pledge of Jephthah. There's no indication of that. Jephthah did that of his own will. Admittedly, I'm exercising my input as an interpreter, concluding that although the pledge might have been all right, would have been a good idea if he'd conditioned it a little bit, said anything other than humans that come out of the house, the door of the house, I'll sacrifice to you. And as an interpreter, I'm conditioning it. I'm further adding my understanding to say that God, I'm convinced, was not pleased by Jephthah's, let's use the word legalistic follow-through on his promise. Consider, for example, earlier we've seen in Leviticus, God has said, child sacrifice, don't do it. In fact, that's the reason the prior inhabitants of the land were wiped out by you, because they were doing child sacrifice. Consider, for Jephthah to have his daughter sacrificed, that's child sacrifice. So how could that be right? Instead, it seems like this is, as the second bullet suggested, one more in the tragic unfolding sequence of the book of Judges, where individualistic morality, that is, people doing what is right in their own eyes, what seemed right to Jephthah, carrying that out, even when it had some veneer of being ethical, was just horrifically opposite what God had in mind. So please join me and don't put this one on God's tab. This is not evidence of a violent God. This is the tragedy of humanity who rejects God and then tries to create an ethical system to replace him and just does horrific things. And sadly, sometimes God gets blamed for it. So those are some cases of violence in the Old Testament, whether it's the flood enacted by God or a plague, 10th plague, against Egypt enacted by God. I mean, you can't attribute those to anyone but God. And understanding, though, other dynamics at work, the victims in the pre-flood society, that he was putting a stop to that victimization. And in the plagues, the gradual escalation till finally Pharaoh gives in, and realizing that God dealt mercifully even along the way. The hail, remember? folks, put your animals under shelter, otherwise they'll be destroyed. Now some exceptions to divine anger and violence in the Old Testament. We want to stay in the Old Testament and ask ourselves, is this angry, violent God, is that the only picture that we have? Perhaps the largest, the most vivid exception to divine anger and violence in the Old Testament arises from Exodus 32 to 34. It's known as the Golden Calf Rebellion. You recall how that works. Israel has just gotten out of Egypt safely. Exodus 19 to 24, God says, okay, folks, let's talk about what just happened. I got you out of Egypt, and here's the proposal. If you'll take me as your God, no other gods, but your only God, then I'm willing to take you as my people. Now, there are some expectations for how to live, and they're the 10 Commandments, come in chapter 20, between 19 and 24. There's some expectations for how to live. Are you in? Do you want to make this a covenant, a deal? And on behalf of the people, the elders say, yes, we're in. God brings them up, these elders, 70 elders, up Mount Sinai, and they enjoy a meal together, and they survive, even in such close proximity with God. And then God says, all right, that's chapter 24. Moses, go back down and sprinkle blood on the people. This is blood of a covenant. It's not blood of redemption or of atonement, but rather that which says the deal is sealed. And that's 24. And then 25, God says, please start building my house, because I want to live in their community. Build my tabernacle, which is the dwelling place of the celestial king. It's a palace. While that is going on, then the people get impatient with Moses' absence, because he's up on Mount Sinai getting these directions. And during that period of time, they conclude that Aaron needs to build them a metal god, who they name Yahweh. They name their Exodus-producing God. But this is a God, obviously, that they can make and they can control. And it's just so preposterous that the God who created the universe and delivered these people would fit in or be represented by a piece of metal that some jewelers hammered together. And yet that's the direction they went. And God says to Moses, it's off. The deal's off. I can't do this. I can't. It's dangerous for them. If my holy presence is too close to them, they are toast. They are destroyed. So it's obviously not going to work. In essence, for their benefit, I've got to keep a distance from them. In fact, let's just wipe them out, restart with you. And Moses says, please give it a second thought. What's everybody else going to say? They're going to say you brought everybody out here and you just didn't want to take care of them. You got tired of them. Or maybe you weren't able to take care of them. So please think of it again. And show me your glory is Moses' petition. And in 34, God shows him his glory. And while there's supernatural things going on around, meteorological and so forth, what is truly amazing is that in Exodus 34, around verse 6, God declares his name, and it's the character that comprises his name: compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, and so on. These are the traits that God says make up himself. This is his genuine identity, his core identity. And on the heels of that, simultaneous with that, God says, I will give them a second chance, Moses. We'll start this again. But they really need to pay attention and abide by the transaction, the covenant that we've formed. So in that golden calf rebellion, and especially in the character of God revealed through his name in Exodus 34, and the behavior of God saying, I will not destroy them, I will extend mercy to them again, we find a pinnacle of, shall we say, exception to divine anger and violence. Here's if at any time anyone deserved to be the recipient of divine anger and violence, it was Israel right then. And God says, I'm not doing it. This is a high point. In fact, some Old Testament scholars have identified this passage as the supreme self-revelation of God in all of the Hebrew Bible. Heschel will be coming back to this incidentally. You'll remember it when we get there towards the end of the lecture. Here's another instance in the Hebrew Bible, an exception to divine anger and violence. Do you remember when Joshua and the Israelites are approaching Jericho? There are a couple of spies that are sent ahead. Rahab welcomes them into her home, gives them shelter, and sends them out secretly so that they can get back to the Israelites safely. Subsequent to that is the destruction of Jericho, except for Rahab. And here is, you recall earlier we were talking about the conquest and the destruction of the families, the nations that were in Israel, Canaanites and so forth, all destroyed. That's the piece, the broad brushstroke description of what happened. Everybody is destroyed. But we all know that Rahab wasn't destroyed. She allied with the Israelites, and she and her family were saved miraculously. I mean, the hunk of the wall where their house was didn't fall down. They were protected. And if that's not an indication of God approving an exception to his universal, wipe out the people of the land because there's such degradation, I've just got to put a stop to that civilization. It's a divinely approved exception to it. Don't want to lose track of that. And here's another that will be much later, during the period of the prophets. You're aware of the story of Jonah. The bulk of the story has to do with whether or not Jonah will be willing to take on the character of God as merciful. Within that, we find a massive illustration of God as merciful. When Jonah gets to Nineveh and proclaims this message, 40 more days and it's over, Nineveh, they respond with repentance, and God suspends the judgment, much to Jonah's dismay. He didn't want them to experience mercy, but for our purposes right now, that's beside the point. Nineveh repents and God relents. God changes his mind and says, okay, hold everything. We are not moving ahead with the judgment that I told you was going to happen. Why? Because these dear people, they changed their mind about practicing wickedness, so I'm going to exercise my divine prerogative to change my mind about judgment, just like that. What's that tell you about God's ultimate objectives? His ultimate objectives in judgment are not to vent his his divine spleen because he's really ticked off at these people. His ultimate objectives are to bring about repentance. And if people will repent, then he will relent. It's kind of nice that rhymes, right? Oh, it's just absolutely critical to the character of God and crucial to the gracious portrayal of God across Scripture. Oh, did you notice which half of the Bible this was happening in? This is Old Testament. So if that's creating trouble in your picture of a violent God, maybe you just want to move the book of Jonah to the New Testament. Okay, I'm messing with your mind, but you get the point. This is OT stuff, okay? Just like Exodus 32 and 34. That's OT. This is the God that we meet in the Old Testament. Did you have a chance to read Heschel's quote here? Kind of paraphrased it, didn't I? I like that last part of it. Its purpose, the purpose of anger, its purpose and consummation, it reaches its highest point when that anger disappears. It's diffused by repentance. That's what God's after. The next bullet point that you've seen appear is judgment against social injustice. Amos is one prophet through whom God coursed this message that said, people you're just treating each other terribly, and I'm very upset about that, and I've got to bring a stop to that. I'm going to punish you for that. Habakkuk also brings a similar message. In essence, he says, God, haven't you noticed how the bad guys are really being rough on the people who are not so bad? You really ought to stop this. So the reason for this bullet point is to say that instances of judgment are occasioned by God's need to stop wrongdoing. It's sort of like having a policeman on the block to deter wrongdoing, or having a referee on the sports court or field to deter wrongdoing. Or if they see there's been a foul committed, they blow the whistle and there'll be a penalty, and then the game kind of gets back on an even keel and carries on again. What that contributes on this particular slide is to remind us that the aim of anger is to respond to injustice. Okay? Like Heschel's quote, there's no divine anger for anger's sake. It's not just I feel like being angry, so I'm going to be angry. No, that's not the way God operates. He's willing to be angry, but there's a motive behind it. There's a fuel, there's an incentive. Something has happened to trigger it. It's not that I had divine indigestion. I don't mean that disrespectfully. It's not just within himself. He's seeing things that are going on, and he loves the creation that he's made, and so it agonizes him when creation is subjected to suffering, and so he works to stop the perpetrators. The last bullet on this page, Hosea's message of grace, is a reminder of a different sort within this beautiful and agonizingly compassionate book of Hosea. We find God saying to his wayward people, northern Israel in particular, he says to them, look, you have wronged me. Much like the Golden Calf Rebellion, right? Here it uses the language and the metaphor of a marriage. And God says, you have wronged me like a wayward wife wrongs her husband, and yet I am willing to give you a second chance. That is a massive exception to divine anger and violence in the Old Testament. In fact, as these catalog and cascade one on top of the other, maybe it's the divine anger and violence which constitutes the exception to the overriding character trait of compassion within God. Something to think about. Here is one more element from the Hebrew Bible, from the Old Testament, that we want to consider before switching over to the New Testament, and it has to do with Job's experience, Job's suffering. You'll recall the story, how Job, despite his righteous conduct, in fact, he's God's pick. When Satan says, I think everyone follows you just because they get a good deal, God says, have you considered Job? In other words, he's my champion, my star player that will prove your theory, Satan, prove it wrong. As a result, you recall that Job experiences loss, bereavement, and then personal affliction, personal illness. And then the book unfolds in this fairly, what should we say, a magisterial wrestling with this dilemma of a good person suffering, theodicy as we call it, the problem of human suffering, and how can God be good if such injustice is at work from a human perspective. Now, some might look at that and say, well, there's another case of this God of the Old Testament who just goes around creating problems for people. He seems to have an axe to grind, and he takes it out on folks. Is that really what's going on here? In other words, does Job suffer because God's mad at him? Quite the opposite, right? Job is God's star pupil. Now I think we'd all agree we'd just as soon not be so high on God's list as to get this kind of a backhanded compliment, being subjected to Satan's punishment, Satan's testing. But nevertheless, that doesn't upset the fundamental principle that it is not an angry God who is causing this to Job. Now, you might have other questions about God, but it's not because God is angry with him. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. So we are not permitted, if we read Job at all intelligently, frankly, we are not permitted to put Job on the list of examples of God being upset, angry, violent. It's not a case of punishment. Instead, Job is God's champion. So much so that he's betting on Job to come through, and some call this the cosmic wager or the divine wager between God and the adversary Satan. He's betting on Job that he will prove to the adversary that there is such a thing as faithful devotion to God, even when that devotion is not rewarded by plentiful crops or healthy children or a marriage that's just supportive, shall we say. You see the expression disinterested piety. This is, among biblical scholars, this is shop talk. How we've come to label this very good character of devotion demonstrated by Job. Disinterested, meaning I'm not in this for what I can get out of it, God. I'm going to be pious, using that in the best sense of the word. I'm going to be fully devoted to you, even if I get nothing out of it. And Satan is wagering, I don't think there's such a thing as disinterested piety. Nobody's really that committed to you, God. They only are committed to you because you pay them out really well. And God says, no, there are people that even when they're not getting anything worthwhile from me, they're still going to be faithful. Try it out on Job. In the next portion of this lecture, then, we're going to turn to the New Testament, and we'll look at typical examples, reminders of divine compassion that we see there. We'll begin with that in the next portion of this lecture.